comes to mind when someone says the name Michael Jackson?
Thriller, the moonwalk, interesting fashion choices, the Neverland Ranch, kids, sleepovers, and now, renewed allegations of sexual abuse.
This weekend, HBO will premiere the new documentary, Leaving Neverland. It tells the story of two men who claim Michael Jackson molested them when they were kids. I'm Donovan Bennett, host and staff writer for Sportsnet.
I'm Sarah Bosveld, senior writer for Chatelaine.
I'm Hadia Rodrigue, writer and recovering lawyer. My feelings about this are really complicated, and I tend to fall on the side of believing survivors. And what's interesting about this case is until now, all the scrutiny into Michael Jackson's case has tended to vindicate him.
But in 2019, we can't nor should we look away. And in this moment of cancel culture, I would love for the conversation to advance beyond whether or not we should still be listening to Michael Jackson.
Jackson is no longer here to defend himself or be punished, but what he left behind was a catalog of music so big, so impactful, it's unrealistic to think he'll fall prey to cancel culture, even though the precedent we've set as a society says it should be.
Welcome to the Pop Panel people. This is our first panel where I'm here in Vancouver. You guys are obviously in our studio in Toronto. And adding to the challenge, the topic this week, it's a controversial documentary that hasn't aired yet, Leaving Neverland. Let's take a quick look at the trailer.
He told me if they ever found out what we were doing, he and I would go to jail for the rest of our lives.
Secrets will eat you up. You feel so alone.
I want to be able to speak the truth as loud as I had to speak the lie for so long.
So this documentary features the stories of two men, Wade Robson and James Safechuck, who once testified on Jackson's behalf during his 2005 trial for child molestation, as it was described in the States, before going public with their allegations a few years ago. And so lots of questions that are being raised by this documentary. And Sarah, beginning with this one, should people watch this on HBO this weekend?
I think they absolutely should. It'll be a troubling and very difficult watch. You know, we have had documentaries come out. There was the R. Kelly documentary series that just was aired a few weeks ago. And this is another one that new in the Me Too era, where people are coming forward with really harrowing and awful stories, experiences of sexual violence. And this is a complex one. You know, Michael Jackson is a major star, a legacy, an icon in our cultural minds. And so to hear these now men talk about the damage that they believe was caused by being victims of sexual abuse, allegedly at the hands of Michael Jackson, is a really important narrative. And I think childhood sexual abuse is something that we as a culture have wanted to look away from in general for a long time, and it's kept it in the shadows. It is so much more common than we think. And I think it will actually help us to understand as a culture, as a society, the complexities of the power dynamics at play when this happens, you know, of just the impact that this has on people's lives as adults.
And Hadia, what sort of issues are being raised for you by the documentary?
I think it's really interesting that these men testified earlier that they weren't abused and then now have this different story. I think people think there's one way to be a victim. And I think this is showing that victimhood is very complex. Being a victim is very complex. You're wrestling with a lot of feelings. It takes a long time sometimes to come to terms with things that have happened to you. And I think that it's showing that we can have different ways that people can be a victim. I think it's also really interesting that this is the stories of men in the Me Too era. We deal a lot with the stories of women, but do we believe boys and men the same way that we believe women nowadays? I think we will see in the response to this documentary.
Donovan, I think of a couple of competing sort of values here. On the one hand, we are being told generally to believe victims, or at least give a lot of weight to what complainants say in documentaries or legal proceedings. On the other hand, this is a documentary. This is, you know, the documentary makers have a particular point of view. We have no way of really testing their credibility as documentary makers. As you watch it, if indeed you do watch it this weekend, how are you going to try to figure out credibility?
Yeah, it's tough, and I think we all should watch it with a grain of salt. And remember that it is a documentary, but it's also entertainment. And part of the reason why this story is being told, because the subject, Michael Jackson, the King of Pop, is so captivating from a celebrity culture standpoint, and it's being done by HBO, home box office. So it's not the New York Times or the Washington Post, and so that journalistic standard that you get with an editor in a newsroom isn't the same when you're making decisions on the cutting room floor for entertainment. So the fact that Michael Jackson's estate is suing HBO, the fact that his voice or someone defending him really isn't present in the documentary, makes me say we should watch and believe, but also question and be skeptical at the same time.
I would push back on that a little bit because I think that I don't think we should have watched the R. Kelly documentary series, for example, with a grain of salt. I think it is absolutely a certain vantage point. But when we're reading news articles, journalistic pieces all the time, we do get both sides, and I do believe that the HBO documentary will say, look, this has been. He was not found guilty in criminal court. That's all really responsible stuff we have to be doing, even if you are doing this as primarily entertainment. But I think documentaries and also this will have a huge power in shaping the public consciousness about how we look at our idols in general.
I'd like to hear probably from all three of you on one other related topic to Michael Jackson. Last night after work, a bunch of us went out, and at the restaurant we were at, they were playing music, and Billie Jean comes on. This morning, driving in, random radio station, Human Nature, this beautiful song of Michael Jackson's. I don't mean this in a trite way. If indeed we feel that he is someone who sexually abused children, especially after watching this documentary, do we have, and maybe I'll start, Hadia, with you, do we have an obligation to not listen to his music at all, or how do we deal with that?
I think it's really interesting because in this case, as compared to R. Kelly, Michael Jackson is dead. And so I think people will draw a distinction because they don't see it as benefiting him because he's no longer around. Where I think for R. Kelly, people see it as, he's paying his legal bills if you listen to him on Spotify or listen to him on another platform. And so I think it'll be a very interesting way it pans out for people. I stand on, if someone plays Ignition, the remix, I stand on the side and I do not engage, and I cross my arms very grumpily if someone plays that. But I wonder what people are going to do if Billie Jean comes on at a wedding or comes on in the car. I really don't think people are going to turn away the same way they used to.
Sarah?
I think his cultural contribution is so massive too, and that's why I think R. Kelly really has not made it to that point. I think there's a really good piece in the Slate talking about Charles Dickens and John Lennon and their contributions. They weren't great people per se, and they had some issues in their past as well. But I do think that we need to look past the cancel culture piece here. I think I might feel weird, especially if I'm listening to a Michael Jackson song with a children's choir in the background. That's not going to age very well. I think we can mature beyond this moment of just canceling people out and just try to learn from this experience and look at our celebrities with a bit more scrutiny.
Donovan, you want to weigh in?
Yeah, I think the issue is, and my favorite phrase is, keep that same energy. And if we're going to tweet mute R. Kelly, then shouldn't we be tweeting mute MJ? And canceling is not just for the artist, it's for the people that they hurt. So if I was someone who was hurt by Michael Jackson and I heard Billie Jean, that would be traumatic for me. And I think that's why, if we're being honest, and we've set that precedent as a culture, if we're willing to cancel all these other people, we shouldn't be counting who has more Billboard top 100s and deciding whether or not we should cancel them.
Okay, so we've got, I don't know, maybe 3 minutes left on a whole new topic, but it's an interesting Canadian story, and it has to do with a comedy channel on Sirius that used to play only Canadian comedy, and then it was bought by, it was called Canada Laughs, then it was bought by Just for Laughs, and that iconic brand was going to dip into their archives, and that includes a lot of Americans in the Just for Laughs archives, a lot of established stars. So Canadian comics said, no way. They started tweeting using the hashtag #JustForMoney, saying that that if the playlist changed on that Sirius channel, it would have a real impact on their income. Donovan, how do you feel about this?
So my initial reaction was, well, get your weight up, Canadian comedians. There are many areas and platforms where you can ply your trade, whether it's podcast or YouTube. But then when I thought about it, I said, well, wait a minute. We're talking about Canadians, and if we were just bringing in arts from the United States, we lose a bit of ourselves.
Yeah.
In this case, via humor, we need our stories told because we are different than U.S. And I don't want to be a diet version of America. That's why it's important to invest in Canadians and recycle our own, because that is our identity. So I think it's great that they stood up for themselves, because we're often docile as Canadians. And I think ultimately they got this right.
Hadia?
We have some uniquely Canadian content, and I don't think an American can really tell a really great Justin Trudeau joke or a really great Rob Ford joke. Yeah. And so I think we want to preserve those elements of our identity. And some people's initial reaction will be a better comic, but people get better by getting exposure. And if we take that exposure away from them, we're taking away from the development of Canadian comics and Canadian comedy. And we're not going to get those stars coming from Canada if they don't get these kinds of platforms.
Sarah, last word to you, 30 seconds.
Also, just you don't make any money as a comedian as well. And I know from this effort, I've learned that there's just been such a fight to find any kind of support from the government, in finding an audience for your work. If that's just closed off as a Canadian comedian, what opportunity or prospect do you even have to maybe make it even bigger? And, it costs so much money to go work in the US because of our laws here. And I think it's not enough to just be on your own channel and on your own podcast. We really do need this cultural investment, and I'm glad they're reversing course.
And the good news is, Just for Laughs changed their policy. They will be playing Canadian comics on that channel, so the money, the small residuals will keep going in there. And for people at home watching, go to a comedy club. They're all across the country, and there's lots of good comics. I went to one a couple of weeks ago here in Vancouver. Where else would you see a comic making jokes about SkyTrain in Surrey? So there you go. It's been fun talking to all of you. Nice doing the pop panel from here. And I guess we're all going to be watching, we're going to be watching The National on Sunday and HBO.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ian.
Bye-bye.